and sustains us. Amen. Some of you have heard the story of my aquatic frogs before. I had two for a while, Chaco and Eno, until one day when I went to feed them and discovered I only had one frog swimming around the bowl. Chaco was a little bigger than Eno, and so though it was sort of horrifying in concept, I figured that the only explanation was that Chaco had gotten hungry. And so I kind of scrutinized him. Was Chaco looking chunkier? I mean, they're aquatic frogs. Where else could Eno have gone? He was just nowhere to be found. Not wanting to believe the worst in Chaco, though, I turned to Google. Aquatic dwarf frogs are not cannibals, I was relieved to discover. Their mouths aren't big enough to eat one another. And while they do occasionally fight, because their eyesight isn't very good and it's easy to mistake anything that bumps into you for a predator, the worst behavior involves, like, the loss of a toe. But after I discovered this, I'm not sure I actually felt any better. Because now the plot had thickened. The mystery was deeper. Where was Eno? He wasn't on the countertop around the bowl. He wasn't on the floor in front of the bowl. He wasn't caught up in the gravel or in the little flower pot or in the little plastic plant. He was just gone. He just disappeared, vanished in the night. And even though it sounds ridiculous, in the midst of that unknown, unsolvable mystery, I couldn't help but think, this is how the disciples must have felt. Except that it was Jesus. Their situation was a little more complicated, because their mysterious disappearance, their empty bowl, tomb situation, it came after a day of quiet. What we now call Holy Saturday. Because after the thing had happened on Good Friday, and before the thing happened on Easter Sunday, well, nothing happened on Holy Saturday. There was just quiet from God, it seemed. So imagine the disciples that day. Imagine the fear that they felt, the discouragement, the disappointment, maybe the anger, certainly uncertainty. But then Sunday does come. The good news comes. But it's still a mystery because the tomb is empty. But what does that mean? John, our gospel writer, who's always so careful with his writing, who's always so careful in crafting his message, suggests a few things to us in this familiar story about what I'll call ill-monikered Thomas. The first thing that catches my attention in the story is that while visiting with the disciples, John notes for us that Jesus breathed on them. And in this phrase, it should evoke some memories for us about the breath of God, the Spirit that is being given. Because you'll remember from the very beginning in the first creation story, the wind of God, the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the chaotic, watery deep, just as creation was beginning. And then in the second creation story that feels more personal, perhaps, but the Hebrew word is the same. God sculpted, not just spoke, humans into being, and then God's wind, God's breath, ruach in the Hebrew, breathed life into those people. And so when John notes for us that Jesus breathed on the disciples, it's not simply a proximity thing. Though that is certainly notable because it means that Jesus was close to them. When we're gathered in small upstairs rooms with others, we too breathe on one another. We share space, we share oxygen. And so simply being gathered with the disciples, Jesus engages in this very ordinary activity, breathing. But, according to John, breathing with intention at this point, because he's breathing the new breath of new life, a new commission into the Missio Dei, the mission of God, of which they're called to be a part. We learn, though, that while the disciples are gathered on that day, Thomas is not with them. It's not clear why he's not there. If he is mourning the loss, the Jewish custom would have meant staying home. Maybe he is disenchanted, though. Maybe he's still confused. We don't know, but he's not there. And so when the other disciples tell him about the experience that they've had, he's not so sure. And that's what earns him this name, Doubting Thomas. But that's not fair. Imagine for a moment that you don't know the whole story, that it's still unfolding before you. It seems worth noting that we don't know the whole story. It is, in fact, still unfolding before us. But imagine you don't know this whole piece. And so, to you, Jesus was there, and then he was captured, and he was killed, and then his tomb was empty. Imagine, if you will, that a group of ever hopeful, still enthusiastically loyal followers begin to tell you that everything's okay after all. Because Jesus, dead Jesus, showed up and spoke to them. It would sound like a mass hallucination. Like maybe they were just a little too hopeful. So this is the part that should be hard to believe. Also eager to believe, Thomas, he doesn't run away from them, doubting their story. He doesn't call them crazy, at least not that we have recorded. He simply protests that he needs to see what the shape of the new commission looks like. He wants to understand something that heretofore would have been impossible to imagine, much less believe could happen. And then the important part is that an entire week later, when the disciples have gathered again, Thomas is with them. He's opting in to their story. He's showing up. He's trying it out. Whatever he's doing, he's choosing to try to believe the impossible. He's not simply doubting. When his head can't wrap itself around the possibility of what's going on. When his heart isn't solely feeling courageous and faithful. He shows up. Presbyterian pastor Mark Davis calls this believing with your feet. When you can't believe with your head and you can't believe with your heart, you believe with your feet, he says. You show up. He says that he shares with his kids, go ahead and doubt. Doubt all that you want. But the best place to doubt is here among the church. Because where and how we show up matters. Because in the midst of whatever is going on with Thomas, because he joined with his community, he was there when Jesus appeared again. And when Jesus comes, he isn't mad at Thomas. He's not frustrated with Thomas. Instead, he says, whatever you need. You need to touch it? Then here. Do what you need to do. Explore what you need to explore. Because I'm here. You take your time. I can only imagine that each of us has or will have that moment when the community is proclaiming something that we want to believe. Something that we too have hoped for. But something that seems impossible. Improbable for sure. How can this be true? How can any of this be true? Well, one of my favorite parts of our tradition is our use of the Nicene Creed on Sunday mornings. Because in it we proclaim our faith. We proclaim our faith together. Because there are times when the faith of the community needs to carry our own personal faith for us. And so maybe there will be weeks when you struggle to believe it. But together the community proclaims, we believe. And so when you can't, we'll believe for you. Because our experience is different from the one that you've had. Because the good news has been revealed to us in a different way this week. But if you just keep showing up, you never know when something as ordinary as bread, as ordinary as breathing, might just make all the difference. Amen.